You know the story, right? A few hundred Spanish conquistadors with steel swords and cannons show up and topple the mighty Aztec Empire. It's a classic tale of heroism, tragedy, and clashing civilizations. But what if that story, the one we've all been told, is mostly a myth? What if the real story is something else entirely?
Now that's a pretty wild statement from historian Juan Miguel Zunzunegui. No conquest? What does that even mean? He's basically throwing down a challenge to everything we think we know. So, if it wasn't a conquest, what in the world was it?
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll dig into this radical idea. Was it a conquest or a birth? Then, we'll look at the so-called empire and see just how shaky it was. We'll check out the playbook Cortés used, and you'll want to stick around for the numbers. They're a real game changer. We'll also ask whose version of the story we're even reading. And finally, we'll explore why this 500-year-old debate is still so incredibly important today.
Okay, let's get right to the core of this whole thing. The central idea is that what happened in 1521, the fall of the great city of Tenochtitlan, wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning.
So this new perspective argues that this wasn't some foreign takeover. It was a massive civil war, an indigenous-led rebellion that just happened to have a Spanish catalyst. And out of that fire, a whole new nation was born, a mestizo or mixed nation. You know, everything we think of as Mexico, the culture, the food, the language, this theory says it wasn't conquered in 1521. It was created.
So how on earth could that be possible? Well, to get it, you have to understand that the Mexica Empire, what we usually call the Aztec Empire, wasn't this one big happy family. Not even close. It was built on some seriously shaky ground.
Think of it less like a kingdom and more like a system of domination. The ruling Triple Alliance basically went around conquering smaller city-states and forced them to pay tribute. This tribute wasn't just gold or food, it was also people who were used for mass human sacrifice. You can imagine that this didn't make the Mexica very popular with their neighbors.
Resentment was absolutely simmering across the land. You had peoples like the Tlaxcalans, who were locked in a continuous war with the Mexica. The Totanics, who were one of the first groups to see the Spanish and think, hey, maybe these guys can help us. It was a political powder keg just waiting for a spark. Cortés didn't create the rebellion, he just showed up and lit the fuse.
So here's the million-dollar question. How did this tiny band of Spaniards, led by Hernán Cortés, manage to put themselves at the head of this enormous indigenous uprising? Well, it turns out Cortés was an absolute master of strategy and psychological warfare.
Just look at this playbook. It's brilliant. He immediately understood the local politics thanks to his interpreter Méjico, who was an intelligence goldmine. He used his horses and cannons not just to win battles, but to create this terrifying, almost godlike image. And the sheer audacity. He burned his own ships so there was no turning back, and he walked into the heart of the empire and took the Emperor Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. It was a masterclass in high-stakes political maneuvering.
Okay, time to talk numbers. Because this is where the traditional story just completely, utterly falls apart. The idea of a few hundred conquistadors taking on an empire of millions? It's a fantasy.
So when Cortés first landed in 1519, he had about 550 soldiers. That's it. Barely enough to fill a large concert hall.
Even 2 years later, for the final, brutal siege of the capital city, after he'd gotten some reinforcements, the Spanish force was still tiny. We're talking maybe 900 men.
So, how did they win? Well, they didn't win alone, not by a long shot. They were joined by an estimated 200,000 indigenous warriors. These were the Tlaxcalans, the Texcocans, and dozens of other groups who were dead set on overthrowing the Mexica. I mean, just look at this. When you see it laid out visually, it's staggering. The Spanish soldiers are just a tiny sliver. This wasn't a Spanish army with a few native guides. This was a massive indigenous army with a small Spanish contingent providing some unique technology and strategy. It completely flips the script on who was conquering whom.
So if the facts and the numbers seem so clear, why do we even have this myth of the heroic Spanish conquest? Well, it's because history isn't just what happened. It's about who tells the story. And in this case, the storytellers had very different agendas.
You've got these two dueling accounts. On one side, you have Gomera, who is basically Cortés's personal PR guy. He wrote a book that made Cortés look like a superhero who won the war almost by himself. But then you have Bernard Diaz, an actual soldier who was there in the mud and the blood. He read Gomera's book and got so angry that he wrote his own version to set the record straight and give credit to the regular soldiers and, crucially, their native allies.
And Bernal Diaz did not pull any punches. He flat out says Gomara is spreading lies, that he's just repeating the flattering stories Cortés told him. This clash of sources is so important when we try to understand what really happened during key moments of the war.
And there is no better example of this historical whodunit than the infamous massacre at the city of Cholula. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies entered the city and slaughtered thousands of unarmed people. The question is, why?
The official Spanish version, the one told by Cortés, is that they discovered a massive trap. They claimed Moctezuma had an army hiding nearby, ready to ambush and wipe them out. So, according to them, the massacre was a brutal but necessary preemptive strike for their own survival.
But there's another theory. This one suggests there was no trap at all. It argues that the Tlaxcalans, who were bitter, longtime enemies of the Cholulilans, basically tricked Cortés into doing their dirty work for them. They used the Spanish to settle an old score. The truth? Honestly, we'll probably never know for sure.
Okay, so this might all seem like an academic debate about something that happened 500 years ago, but according to thinkers like Zunzunegui, the way this story is told has a huge, real-world impact on Mexico's identity right now.
The traditional story, the one about being conquered, creates what he calls a national trauma. It builds an identity based on being a victim, on being the descendants of the defeated. It's a narrative that can lead to a sense of helplessness, framing today's problems as the fault of something that happened centuries ago.
But what happens if you flip that script? If it wasn't a conquest, but a massive civil war and the birth of a new nation? Well, suddenly, everyone involved, the Spanish, yes, but also the Tlaxcalans, the Texcocans, all of them, they're not just conquerors or conquered, they're all founders, ancestors. It transforms the story from one of defeat to one of a complex, violent, but shared creation.
So, in the end, what was it? A brutal foreign invasion that crushed a civilization? A massive indigenous civil war that the Spanish simply took advantage of? Or was it the bloody and painful birth of the nation we now call Mexico? There are no simple answers. The events of 1521 are locked in the past, but the story we tell ourselves about it is still very much alive, and it continues to shape the present.